For today's video, I'm going to show you how to create one of these low-tech moss carpets in your own aquarium. I honestly think that this is the easiest carpet and plant that you can grow when done in this way. I've touched on these in a few other videos and I often get questions about how I make them and what kind of care they need, so I wanted to publish this video going over everything. So let's start with how we actually make one of these moss carpets, as it's really simple. First, you're going to need some moss, and for this tank I'm using Christmas moss, but I will touch on other moss options later in the video. Next, you're going to need a base, and for this particular example I'm using a stainless steel aquarium grade, but again I'll go over more options later in the video. Once you've got these, it's just a matter of placing small amounts of moss onto your chosen base, spreading it around into a thin layer, and then wrapping thread around it several times to hold the moss in place. This is what it should look like when you're finished with the first moss mat ready to build out your carpet. I know that it looks a little bit rough, but don't worry, the moss will quickly start to grow in and start to form that beautiful lush carpet. Once you have one of these, you just repeat the process until you have enough moss covered base plates to fill the area where you want a carpet in your tank. This is what mine looked like in the aquarium once I first added them to the tank, and as you can see, it's really not that impressive at this stage. But this is what they looked like after 3 months, once the moss had some time to grow and spread and things are really starting to take shape in just 3 months. Jumping forward to the 5 months point, and you can see that it's filling out really nicely in the tank, forming a full lush layer across the bottom of the aquarium. Finally, this is what the tank's looking like today, around 13 months after the original setup. The moss has grown in beautifully, and the best part is I've never had to trim it once, making it a truly low maintenance carpet for any type of low-tech setup. So moving on, and I want to talk about a few different types of moss that you can use, because not all moss types are created equally. Christmas moss is a great option, but it can be trickier to grow than some of the other more popular mosses in the hobby. If you're new to the planted tank hobby and you want the highest chance of success, I really recommend that you go with Taiwan moss. I've used this in several aquariums now with different water parameters, different lighting intensities, different photo periods, different temperatures, and no matter what tank I put it in, it always consistently grows well. Not only is Taiwan moss easier to grow than Christmas moss, but it also has a very similar appearance once it's grown in, catching the eye. Another solid option is good old Java moss, which is sometimes sold under the name Boga moss depending on your location. It's generally considered very easy to grow, and personally I've never had any issues with it in any of my tanks, but I have seen some other people saying it's been problematic for them. Unlike Taiwan moss and Christmas moss, which tends to spread out sideways as it grows, Java moss also seems to grow in every direction. Thankfully, with this specific carpeting method, this really isn't a problem, because we can just remove the entire moss mat from the aquarium and trim the excess moss down as required. This not only makes it quick and easy to trim our moss, but it also takes the moss out of the tank for trimming, so there's no chance of small pieces floating off, settling somewhere in the tank and growing huge amounts of moss where you don't want it. And then circling back to Christmas moss, and this one can be a little temperamental under certain conditions, but that's what I'm using in this tank, and it's low tech and it's thriving. Just to give a quick breakdown of this particular tank, because it's only running a cheap 10-watt light that costs less than $20 US, and on top of that there's a layer of duckweed on the surface, further limiting light penetration. There's no CO2 injection or liquid fertilizers or anything like that either. It's a low-tech Wallstatt method tank, and the Christmas moss just grows. There are a few other moss varieties in the hobby, but I've never personally tried any of them, and some of them are considered more advanced types of moss, so always do your research if you're thinking of trying anything other than the ones featured in the video. Next up, I want to talk about choosing the right base for your moss carpet. For this specific setup I used stainless steel mesh, but I have had a few comments from viewers concerned about rust, which is completely understandable. This specific stainless steel mesh that I use is made for aquarium use, so it has a higher amount of chromium in the alloy mix, which can help make it more rust resistant. Mine has been in this tank for over a year now and it has no signs of rust, but I do understand why some people are hesitant. That's why for the moss mat in my newer tank I've switched over to a 3D printed base made by one of my friends who runs MMS Design Concepts on Etsy. These are made from aquarium-safe materials and let you clip the moss in place easily so there's no thread required. That's a great option if you are worried about fabric fibres in your tank from the thread circling around and your fish eating them and then it causing problems with their digestive system. Alternatively, instead of using the 3D printed grid to trap the moss in the middle, you can just use it as two individual pieces and then secure your moss with thread. Another option that I've had people comment on my videos saying that they use but I have no personal experience with are these plastic mesh mats designed for different types of needlework. These should work perfectly fine, but if I was going to use one of these I would double check the specific types of plastic that's used to make it and make sure that everything is aquarium safe. Next up I want to talk about lighting requirements since I do get a few different questions about this one as well. As I mentioned earlier, Christmas moss is generally considered a little bit more demanding than Java moss and Taiwan moss, and most plant nurseries recommend moderate light intensity for it. But with today's modern LED aquarium lights, even budget-friendly options can easily meet their demands like the lights I'm using. As I mentioned earlier, it's literally the smallest option out of the Sciora SR616 range because this is just a small nano tank and it's a 10 watt light that costs less than $20 US. But despite this being a budget friendly option, it easily kicks out enough light for my Christmas moss to grow, and like I mentioned earlier, there's duckweed on the surface blocking some of the light too. Again though, if you are wanting to maximise your chances of success, something like Java moss or Taiwan moss is probably a better option because they are low light requirement plants and extremely easy to grow. For example, I once kept a Taiwan moss mat in an old shrimp jar that literally ran on a 6 watt USB light and it grew without issue. So in my opinion, as long as you're sticking with one of the moss types that I've recommended in this video and you're going with a modern LED light, it really shouldn't be a problem and your moss should grow without issue. I also want to quickly touch on Substrate since I've had a few different questions about Substrate for this type of carpet as well. I completely see where this comes from if you're new to the planted tank side of the hobby because my moss carpet's grown out so you can't see the grids under it. But moss is actually an epiphyte plant, meaning that you'd usually attach it to hardscape in your tank rather than try and put it into the substrate. That's why I use these bases for my moss mats, as it keeps the moss in place without me needing to put hardscape or anything like that there, and on top of that, the mats are flat, letting me get the carpet effect. I have experimented with planting moss directly in my substrate a few times, but every single time it melts off at the point of contact with the substrate and the rest of the moss just ends up floating around in the tank. That said, while moss doesn't root directly into the substrate, the type of substrate that you are using can play a role, especially when working with more demanding types of moss like Christmas moss. This is due to different biological processes that happen in the substrate, and for example, this particular one is a Wohlstadt method tank with a capped dirt base. As the organic matter in the soil breaks down, beneficial waste-eating bacteria help release small amounts of CO2 into the water. This passive CO2 can give plants, especially more demanding ones, a little bit of a boost to help them grow. Over time, detritus will naturally build up in your tank once it becomes established and do a similar thing, but with the Wohlstadt method or any type of capped dirt setup, it just gives you a little bit of a kickstart from the beginning. But with that said, I really don't think it matters for the easier types of moss like Java moss and Taiwan moss, and I literally grew Taiwan moss in a tub with no nutrient source on a windowsill over winter with no heater, and it just kept growing without issue. But with Christmas moss, it is a more demanding plant, often listed as medium category, so stuff like this will come into play more. Finally, I want to quickly go over how you can keep your moss carpet clean, because it's really not as difficult as people think. My number one tip by far is to get shrimp, and ideally lots of them. It doesn't matter if it's a small army of cherry shrimp like the ones in this tank, or a different variety of Neocaridina shrimp, or something like our mono shrimp instead, they will all do an amazing job. As you might have noticed in the video clips, the cherry shrimp in this tank are constantly picking through the moss, picking off algae and biofilm, any leftover food, different types of decaying plant matter, and various other things, keeping it spotless. As I mentioned earlier, moss mats are very easy to just remove in full from the aquarium for when you need to trim them, and once you're doing the trimming, you can just wash them under the tap to get rid of anything that's trapped in them if you need to as well. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end, and I honestly think that moss mats are one of the easiest carpeting options for the average low-tech aquarium. Not only can they fill in your carpet quickly, but they're also low maintenance, and like I mentioned earlier, this one's over a year old and I still haven't had to trim it once. But thanks for watching the video guys, I hope it's been helpful, and good luck with your aquarium moss carpets.